Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on the worst maintained air forces on the continent of Africa. Now, when you think of African militaries and African Air Force, you sometimes think of air forces like the Egyptian Air Force, or modern air forces like the South African Air Force, or maybe even the Air Force of, let's say, Tunisia, or maybe even Morocco or Algeria. Or if we're going to the southern African countries, you think of countries with air forces like Uganda, for example. But there is one air force that has warplanes that are so outdated that these planes can no longer even fly. Yes, and that air force is the Guinea-Bissauan Air Force, which has been operating since 1974 when Guinea-Bissau gained its independence from Portugal during the Portuguese colonial war of 1955 to 1974. Now, currently, the Air Force of Guinea-Bissau has about 14 aircraft altogether. 15 to 16 if you count the two newer aircraft that were purchased since 2011. Now, the Air Force mostly consists of old Soviet and French aircraft that were purchased in the 1970s, 80s, and early 1990s. But the main problem with the Guinea-Bissau Air Force is that there is only one, count them, one aircraft that is currently operating with the Guinea-Bissau Air Force as of 2022. And that aircraft is a single American-made Cessna twin-seat trainer aircraft that was purchased from the United States in the 2010s. Now, Guinea-Bissau on paper has a somewhat medium-sized fleet of mostly older Soviet and French-made aircraft. For example, Guinea-Bissau has 6 Soviet-made Mikoyan Gorevich MiG-21 Fishbed fighter and ground attack aircraft that were purchased way back in the 1970s and 80s. They also have at least 1 or 2 MiG-15 or Mikoyan Gorevich MiG-15 fighter and trainer aircraft that were purchased back in the 80s and early 1990s. Several MiG-17 fighter and ground attack aircraft that were purchased again in the 80s and early 1990s. And they have a multitude of fixed-wing transport and cargo aircraft, which includes old Soviet-made Antonov AN-2s, Yakolov Yak-40s, and a number of older-made Russian and French Cold War vintage helicopters, like the Soviet-made Mi-8 HIP light or medium utility helicopter, which Guinea-Bissau has at least 1 or 2 of. At least 3 French-made Aerospatiale Alouette 2 and Alouette 3 light utility helicopters that were purchased from France in the 1980s and 1990s. And they have other trainer aircraft, like the aforementioned Cessna 150 and the Cessna FTB 337, along with a few even older planes that were purchased from the US and Germany, for example, the American Douglas DC-3 and the German Dornier Do 20. Now, out of all these aircraft, only a single plane, the Cessna 150, is currently in use by the Guinea-Bissau Air Force. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was the main backer of Guinea-Bissau during the later half of the Cold War from 1974 until 1989 and 1991, Guinea-Bissau collapsed into 2 separate civil wars which occurred back in the 1990s. The first one happening, a miniature war, happened in 1991, the same year as the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a second, larger civil war broke out in the year 1998. During that time period, the Guinea-Bissau Air Force operated against a variety of different rebel groups operating in the country. But since the early to late 2000s, the Air Force of Guinea-Bissau has pretty much been abandoned slowly over the span of a decade or more. From 2001 until 2011, most of the warplanes, we're talking 98% of all of the aircraft used by the Guinea-Bissau Air Force, were left abandoned in various hangars across the country, including the main air base at the Osvaldo Vieira International Airport, which also serves as an air base for the Guinea-Bissau Air Force. Up until 2011, there were only 2 aircraft operating, the aforementioned Cessna and one of the French-made Alouette 3 utility helicopters. only a single plane remains operational, the Cessna. If you actually visit some of the air bases in Guinea-Bissau, you can actually see a large number of planes that are just left abandoned in their hangars. The airfields in which these aircraft were operating out of have largely been abandoned and are now covered in vegetation and foliage. So it is safe to say that the government of Guinea-Bissau simply does not have the money to maintain any of these old Soviet-made and French and American-made warplanes from the Cold War era. And as a result, they only have this single Cessna trainer in use with the current Air Force. This is basically it. Unless they come up with some more money, they basically don't really have an Air Force. It's just a single trainer. All of the old Soviet-made aircraft are pretty much lying derelict in their hangars. The only aircraft that could be put back into service pretty quickly are the helicopters like the Mi-8, the Mi-4, and the French-made Aerospatiale Alouettes 2 and 3s. Everything else is literally starting to rust as I speak in their hangars. So what do you all think of this? This is literally one of the saddest sights you can see when it comes to the Air Force of a nation. The Air Force of Guinea-Bissau, an Air Force that basically almost doesn't exist with the exception of a single Cessna aircraft trainer. So what do you all think of this? Please tell me in the comment section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.